The grey-haired warrior breathed deeply and slowly released his breath. He focused on the steady rise and fall of his chest, forcing the cold tight knots in his stomach to loosen. One would think, meeting your king is easier, he mused silently, a faint wry smile touching his lips, than facing the advancing hordes of the enemy. He remembered the last time he felt this nervous, standing on the second wall of the keep for the first time, his young fingers slick with sweat against the ashwood shaft of a pike. He smiled at the memory of the young boy trying to be brave on that distant day. He remembered how the dust rose before the hot sun as thousands of feet marched on their little town, the steady rhythmic rumble of the earth shaking the water in the tavern buckets. Today, the world was quiet. He sat comfortably on the low marble bench, his back straight despite the ache in his lumbar spine. He waited to see the king on a veranda of pristine stone, where white jasmine and purple clematis grew over elaborate iron trellises. Birds sang somewhere in the manicured orange groves nearby, their calls bright and untroubled by the realities of the border. From the corridor behind him came the sharp, distinct flop-flop of leather sandals, the unmistakable stride of a palace official walking past the stone column. Chamberlain Fabian struggled to keep his disgust in check as he walked to fetch the warrior. His eyes flicked down toward the marble floor, checking for any trace of grit or stable mud. Everybody in the capital knew what these people had done for the kingdom. Fabian supposed he had his own life to thank for such as this one. If the eastern border had collapsed during the last campaign, the silk markets would have burned. But they were still of the outcasts. They belonged to the grit, not the marble. Fabian looked at the veteran's clothes. He felt a small wave of relief, noting that the man wore clean, heavy blue linen, free of stains or dust. At least this one had no raw, uncovered physical disfigurement to offend the eyes of the court. Fabian shuddered involuntarily as he thought of his own sister's hidden hunchback. The family shame kept behind locked doors in the lower estate. These two probably knew each other, he thought bitterly. Birds of a broken feather. Joshua caught the look. He knew what the official saw. A clean coat, a straight posture, and an empty left sleeve pinned neatly to the breast. The fabric hid the truth. Beneath the blue linen, Joshua's left forearm ended in a blunt, scarred knot of tissue, the result of a downward slash from an enemy broadsword during the chaotic melee at the Battle of the Red Stone. His left leg was no better. A heavy horse had stepped directly on his knee joint during that same cavalry charge, crushing the bone into fragments. Joshua had survived that day only because he managed to ram his iron spear upward into the knight's side, finding the narrow 2-inch gap between the armour plates before his own arm was severed. The medics later found the knight dead next to his horse, the spear still embedded in his ribs. Now, Joshua stayed upright using a rigid, cold hammered iron and leather brace that locked his ruined knee into a stable column. His soldier's pension did not buy him luxury. Every single silver coin went directly to an old comrade, Andrew, who was now an innkeeper in the eastern part of the city. He brought a weekly supply wagon out to the outcast village. "Please follow me, sir," Fabian said as he walked past the warrior. He did not stop to see if the veteran followed. He simply assumed compliance, his sandals slapping against the stone as he hurried back toward the grand chamber. Joshua stood. The iron hinges of his knee brace gave a sharp, metallic clack. He adjusted his coat, steadied his balance, and followed. With every step, his boots made a distinct, an even melody against the smooth mosaic floor. Clack thump. It was a loud, mechanical machinery of survival invading a hallway built for soft whispers. The heavy oak doors of the grand chamber swung outward. The fresh, clear scent of the jasmine veranda vanished instantly. It was replaced by the thick, heavy air of the court, a dense fog of distilled lavender, beeswax, and old, expensive parchment hung in the room. High windows, cut into the polished marble walls, let the mid-morning sun cast long, sharp shafts of white light across the floor tiles. The light highlighted the gold and embroidered on the tunics of the gathering nobility. Joshua stepped inside. His boots made a distinct, uneven melody against the smooth mosaic floor. Clack thump. The mechanical machinery of his iron knee brace sounded loud and invasive in a hallway built for whispers. He stopped at the designated brass marker at the base of the dais. His back was straight, his eyes fixed forward. He did not speak. By the ancient decrees of the Exarchate of Orosia, a soldier of his rank possessed no voice in the high presence unless directly commanded by the crown. At the far end of the room sat the king, He was a heavy, silent and observant presence. He was a ruler currently expanding an empire through calculated patience. Duke Marcus stepped forward. His silk robes rustled as he bowed deeply to the throne, completely ignoring the veteran standing a few paces away. "We bring a grave matter of state before the throne," the Duke began. His voice carried the smooth, dangerous tone of a seasoned politician. "A matter of treason that threatens the very architecture of your peace. The rogue vanguard has returned. Captain Joshua has abandoned his post of retirement to organize the outcasts into a lawless paramilitary front at our gates." The Duke turned slightly, gesturing toward Joshua with a ringed hand. 2 months ago, at the critical Eastern Mountain Pass, a royal detachment under my son's command was assaulted, disarmed, and publicly humiliated, Duke Marcus declared. He pointedly ignored the reality that his son had been outsmarted by a civilian builder. Instead, he chose to elevate the scuffle into a military conspiracy. He used his knowledge of our tactics to orchestrate the ambush. He shielded a foreign vagrant and made a mockery of the royal lineage. Standing just behind the Duke, Lord Julian's pale face flushed with anger. "He forced my men into the mud." The young noble burst out, forgetting himself. "He stripped us of our sidearms and paraded us before those grimy exiles like common thieves. He openly defied the royal command. We demand the maximum penalty under the imperial code. Your Majesty, execution and the clearing of the canyon." "He is retired, my lord," a quiet voice rumbled from the left side of the chamber. Duke Marcus snapped his gaze toward the ward's bench, his eyes narrowing. General Varus stood up. The heavy plates of his immaculately cleaned armor scraped against his stone seat. The steel was polished to a high gleam for the court, but it bore the deep, permanent battle notches and ancestral scars of a dozen campaigns. He stepped onto the marble floor. His boots were heavy and unhurried as he walked to the center of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder with the silent, broken veteran. "A captain cannot speak in this chamber, Duke Marcus," Varus said. His voice dropped into the room like an anvil. "Therefore, as his former commanding officer, I speak for him, and I speak for the law." Joshua's retirement was bought with his left arm at the red stone. His loyalty to the realm is written in his scars. This was no coup, Your Majesty. This was a veteran defending the military code, from a young officer who does not understand the difference between a military deployment and a personal raid. The grand chamber went entirely still. The lavender-scented air felt thick, suffocating. Behind the translucent screen, a shadow moved. The king stood up. He stepped down from the throne, his heavy dark robes trailing on the marble. He was an older man, his face lined with the harsh realities of rule. His dark eyes carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. He looked at the Duke, then at the general, and finally, his gaze settled on the quiet veteran with the pinned blue sleeve. The king looked deeply into Joshua's eyes, searching for the truth beneath the courtly theatre. "The politicians have spoken, Captain," the king said. His voice was low, resonant, and entirely unyielding. "The generals have spoken. Now, I will hear the truth from the man who actually knows how to bleed. Tell me of this master in the desert. Tell me your version." Joshua swallowed. He cleared his throat. "Your Highness, on the day of the summer solstice, we were woken at dawn by a loud clap out of the desert. As we stumbled out of our tents, we saw pink and purple colors swirling and hovering at the eastern edge of the salt pan. As it started to fade, one of the women pointed at the figure of a man, stumbling towards us. Moshe. Rose and I ran towards him. He was too weak to walk. Rose brought him into her tent and kept him alive through the night." Master opened his eyes, and the world immediately tilted. The air tasted like stale salt and dry canvas, nothing like the cold mineral dark of the cave. He lay still, letting the wrongness of it register. A different world. He had made it through. The memory of the crossing came in fragments. The violet fire of the tear-splitting reality open, his cells screaming at the velocity of the shift. Then the four ancient presences seeping into him like liquid light. The biological handshake that had rewritten him from the inside out. He had survived the cave by consuming them. He was still not entirely sure what that made him. Orma's voice arrived first, precise and geometric as ever. "Calibrate the sensory matrix. Local atmospheric pressure is higher than your baseline. Your inner ear requires exactly 90 seconds to find true horizontal Do not pivot your head. Let him pivot, Kyo countered softly. Listen to the voices outside, Master. They are afraid, but they are also kind. The morning heat is already rising, Syrinx remarked. Her voice crackled like static behind his eyes. If he lies there tracing perfect right angles, the sweat will simply glue his brilliant mind to that cot. Master ignored them. He focused on his mother's voice instead, the one that had never left him. Even here, work with what you have. A strange double vision that had plagued him since the crossing, the world briefly overlaid with geometric shadow, faded slowly back into ordinary reality. A conical nomad tent, oil-cured hides, a tripod of weathered juniper poles. He sat up. Next to his low cot, his gear sat in an organized pile. Someone had washed the cave mud from his canvas-filled jacket, folding it neatly alongside his boots. His modular survival staff lay across his backpack, its steel blade sheathed. The largest shimmering fragment of dragon eggshell was capped securely on the handle. The thin hide flap of the tent did little to block the voices drifting from the small fire pit outside. Master closed his eyes, letting Kyo guide his focus to the human shape of the sounds. He's moving again, a woman's voice said. It was warm, carrying the weary, steady cadence of a maternal protector. Someone used to long days of heavy physical labor. His breath is steadying. The salt crust on his forehead is breaking. He is a ghost, Rose, another woman replied. Her tone was sharper, quicker, entirely unguarded and defensive. Look at the skin on his hands. He fell out of the sky with nothing but a fancy walking stick and the jacket full of junk. Andrew says the King's scouts are already patrolling the low ridges. If this stranger cannot walk by noon, he is merely the liability we cannot afford to bury. He has very heavy boots, Mama. A third voice chimed in. It was a younger melodic voice, marked by a gentle, deliberate slowness that held no fear, only pure curiosity. They have thick iron buckles. They look like they belong to someone who builds things. Boots do not make the man beggar. Rose sighed softly. The sound was accompanied by the dull clatter of a wooden bucket, but they might keep his feet off the clay pan. Let us see if he will drink the well water before Mary frightens him away. Master stood up. His legs felt like heavy columns of dry clay. He reached down, gripped the cold steel chassis of his staff, and used the leverage to steady his balance. He pushed the hide flap aside and stepped out into the blinding white glare of the desert edge. The heat hit him like a physical blow. It smelled of ancient dust and sulphur. The landscape was a vast, flat plain of cracked grey clay. It stretched eastward until it dissolved into a trampling heat mirage. To the immediate west, at the edge of the salt pan, the mountain steadily grew steeper. It erupted into a brutal wall of grey rock. Behind the tents, a ravine opened up into the unknown. The cliff face was a complex maze of deep vertical cracks and layered sandstone shelves. It presented a massive structural canvas. 3 women stood near a small fire of dried scrub wood. Master watched them quietly, letting Kyo interpret the subtle cues of their posture. Rose stood with her hands on her hips. Her rounded shoulders were bent slightly from years of carrying water, yet her eyes held an immense tired emotional intelligence. Mary stood slightly behind her, arms crossed tightly as if creating her own shield against the world. Becca sat on a smooth log, her smile open and completely freed of the suspicion that guarded her elders. "Ah, the sleeper awakens," the dry, mocking voice sparked from the shadow of a nearby leather lean-to. Glib crawled out into the sunlight on his hands and leather-padded knees. His voice dripped with absolute cynicism. His twisted legs dragged behind him like dead wood, his head tilted up with a bitter defensive sneer. Behind him walked Mose, a 7-foot giant with a thick unkempt beard and a soft vacant look in his wide eyes. Mose moved with a heavy limp, his posture slumped forward as if trying to make his massive frame invisible to a world that rejected him. "Don't mind Mary," Glib spit out, looking up at Master with cold evaluation. "She thinks every bush hides a royal tax collector, though why they'd come to a trash heap like the desert dump is beyond me. I am Glib. The big column of useless muscle behind me is Mose, with the leftover scraps of the kingdom. Just broken garbage waiting for the sun to finish us off. Welcome to what the world calls the desert dump. We call it the Dune City on the days we feel less depressed." The defeat in the camp was thick. It was a heavy social rot that Kyo highlighted in Master's mind. They saw themselves exactly as the capital saw them, worthless, discarded and waiting to die. Rose stepped forward, breaking the tension. She held out a chipped earthenware mug filled with brackish lukewarm water. "Drink. It tastes like lime, but it is wet." Master took the mug with his right hand, his fingers steady. Instead of looking at the horizon or checking the stone, he looked directly into Rose's eyes. Then he matched the gaze of Mary, Beckett and finally Glib. He saw beyond the dirt and tattered clothes. He saw the kind humanity of strangers who had helped him without asking questions first. "Thank you, Rose. This is delicious. My name is Master H," Master said, handing the cup back with genuine quiet respect. He looked at Glib. His voice was flat but entirely lacking the pity the outcasts usually received. "You are not broken garbage, Glib, and this is not a trash heap." Glib snorted, looking away bitterly. Easy to say for a man with whole legs. "Tell me about yourselves," Master said, sitting down on a low rock near the fire, placing his staff across his knees. He looked around the small downtrodden camp, his expression filled with deep, patient curiosity. "How long have you been surviving out here? Tell me your stories." Glib blinked, caught off guard by the question. For the first time in years, someone was asking to understand them, rather than ordering them away. Prince Saffron walked onto the high terrace balcony at dawn. The cool desert wind moved the heavy silk fringes of his morning cloak. He lifted a silver chalice of dark palm wine to his lips, his hand shaking slightly. As the morning light caught his skin, he noticed the dark drying smears of the concubine's blood across his knuckles and beneath his fingernails. If Bashaw, the huge soft-hearted eunuch, had not physically pulled him off her, Saffron would have likely killed the woman with his bare fists. She had been his father's favourite concubine. In his hollow, desperate grief, Saffron had summoned her to his chambers, hoping her familiar touch would quiet the screaming inadequacy inside his chest. But the girl had made a fatal error. She assumed the young prince was a safe person around whom to share her own grief for the dead king she genuinely admired. He was not a safe person. He hated his father, and he loved him with a desperate, suffocating intensity. But he had never felt good enough in the old man's presence. Hearing her praise the dead monarch's strength had broken something raw in Saffron's mind. Hours later, he ordered Bashaw to drag her down to the low harbour docks, transforming her into a common wharf whore for the Rose. Sipping the date wine as the grey sky slowly gave way to morning, Saffron stared out over the vast, rolling waste of the great dune sea. Suddenly, a violent flash of violet and deep pink light cut horizontally across the western horizon. Moments later, a sharp metallic clap of dry thunder rolled over the dunes, rattling the glass panes of the sun's spire. Saffron's breath hitched. There were no storm clouds in the sky. What was this? A sign from the ancient desert gods. He watched the last of the violet light fade from the eastern horizon, his mind racing. As a child, Saffron had been forced to endure the dusty, monotonous lectures of court historians. He remembered one aged scholar, a man Saffron had whipped for his stuttering, mumbling about the fracture of the heavens and the vengeful desert gods who once paved the way for great conquerors. At the time, Saffron had dismissed the tale as the ramblings of a senile coward. Now the memory burned with the clarity of a fever. He turned from the balcony, his robe sweeping behind him. "Bashaw," he barked, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "To the archives. Now." Within minutes, Saffron sat at the centre of the royal library, a sprawling dark chamber carved directly into the seaside cliff. He occupied a massive mahogany chair, drinking wine from a silver flagon and rhythmically popping grapes into his mouth, his eyes fixed on the librarian's frantic movements. "Faster!" he screamed at a trembling scribe who scrambled to pull ancient brittle scrolls from the highest shelves. "If you do not find the text on the desert signs before the candle burns out, I will have your fingers for calligraphy pens." He spent hours in the gloom, tearing through forgotten maps and theological treatises. He found what he sought, an illustration of a violet fracture in the sky above the sands. Described as the sign of the shattered gate, Saffron traced the jagged lines with a greedy finger. It was not a weather event. It was a mandate. The next day, Prince Saffron summoned the spymaster Sela Kayan and advisor Hammond Jashan to the high terrace. He did not ask his advisors to investigate the sky. He stood before them like a prophet demanding confirmation of his own divinity. and told them what he had seen. "The gods have cracked the desert wide open," Saffron declared. His eyes were bright with a dangerous glassy intensity as he paced the marble floor. "They recognized in me a peer, one who would know how to honor them. They did not show the violet tear to the old king nor to the Orosian weaklings in the west. They showed it to me." He stopped at the balustrade, gesturing wildly toward the barren horizon where the heat waves already began to dance over the dune sea. "My father spent his life hoarding gold and hiding behind maritime treaties," Saffron whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying fervor. "I will not be a mere footnote in his ledger. I want a monument built at the exact coordinates of the violet flash. A colossal tower of polished basalt, 500 cubits high, bearing my likeness. It will cast its shadow directly across the Orosian border. Every morning, that arrogant Orosian princess and her preening lords will wake to see my face blotting out their sun. I will overshadow their entire history." As he spoke her name, the old festering wound of his youth flared bitterly in his mind. 10 years ago, as a fragile, awkward teenager with broken skin and a cracking voice, he had met the Princess of Orosia in a ceremonial pavilion, overwhelmed by insecurity. He had stumbled over his greetings. The princess had suddenly stared at him with wide, panicked eyes, stood up abruptly, and fled the pavilion without a word, leaving her attendants scrambling in confusion. Saffron had interpreted her sudden flight as a supreme act of cold aristocratic disgust, a public humiliation that branded him a monster. He never learned the hidden truth. The young princess had experienced a sudden, heavy and painfully unexpected onset of her first menstrual cycle, fleeing solely to escape an agonizing public embarrassment. To Saffron, her flight was a declaration of war against his person, an insult that demanded the burning of kingdoms to erase. Hammond Jashan rolled his amber beads with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His heavy face remained perfectly blank while his mind calculated the unprecedented scale of the iron and stone contracts. He stepped forward, his oily voice dropping into a register of profound, reverent gravity. "A tower is a grand vision, your highness," Jashan murmured, slanting his eyes toward the prince. "But why settle for a stone marker on a desert border? A king builds monuments to mark his limits. An emperor raises them." Saffron blinked, his manic pacing coming to an abrupt halt. An emperor. The late king was a cautious man, content to rule a coastal protectorate. Jashan continued, stoking the fire with calculated precision. "He lacked the stomach to see what you see. You possessed the vision of a conqueror, Prince Saffron. You were not born to sit in the damp sea spray of cities counting harbour tariffs. The gods did not break the sky to command you to build a statue. They broke it because they have judged the Orosian Exarchate unworthy, and they have appointed you to claim their marble high seats." Saffron's chest swelled beneath his heavy silks, his fragile ego greedily drinking in the poison. "An empire," he breathed, dismissing the two with a flick of his wrist. When they returned, they did not offer praise. They offered caution. "We have studied your vision, Highness," Hammond Jashan said, his voice a masterclass in feigned concern. "The desert is a cruel mistress. Your father knew this, which is why he stopped at the dunes. But if an empire is what you command, Highness, then an empire is what we shall seize," the spymaster whispered, his raspy voice cutting through the prince's nervous silence. "My informants have confirmed a fatal vulnerability," Sealer said, his skeletal fingers unrolling a weathered parchment map across the stone table, baring his teeth in a cold smile. He pointed a long yellowed fingernail at the western terminus of the Great Salt Pan. "There is a forgotten gorge, the Desert Dump. The Orosian elite use it as a refuse heap, abandoning their sick, deformed, the slow-minded, the broken in body and thought, as exiles to rot in the dust. The Orosian military leaves that canyon entirely unfortified, believing the geography is impassable and the inhabitants are nothing but brainless, broken wretches." Saffron stared at the map, his mind completely untethered from reality. The spymaster leaned closer, his eyes locking onto Saffron's erratic gaze. "That gorge leads directly into the unprotected rear terraces of the Exarchate's palace gardens. While Duke Marcus bickers in court, your vanguard will emerge from the outcasts' tents like scorpions from the thatch. We will use their own garbage heap to slit their throats, and you will take your seat on the throne of Orosia before they even realize the desert has moved." Saffron sighed contentedly and sat back on his throne. Sealer Kyne stepped forward, his skeletal face illuminated by the flickering torchlight. "I have mapped the path, Prince. It is possible, but it requires the most ambitious engineering undertaking in our history. To cross it, you would need to conquer the logistics of a ghost empire. An army cannot march across 80 miles of dry salt without waterprints, Jashan noted cautiously, feigning resistance to drive the trap deeper. The treasury would need to fund thousands of iron water cisterns, buried grain caches, and hundreds of leather transport wagons, all moved secretly, hidden beneath the surface so no Orosian scout suspects our movement. You would need to turn every winter ostrich hunting permit into a supply convoy. Then build them. Saffron barked, slamming his chalice onto the marble armrest. Divert the coin from the harbour defences. Saffron stood up, his face flushed with the pride of a man who believed he had just birthed a brilliant strategy. Yes, Saffron whispered, his eyes widening. We hide the army in plain sight. We bury the road beneath the sand. Most would call it impossible, but you are blessed by the gods' highness, Jashan murmured, his tone appropriately reverent. Let the new empire begin, Saffron whispered, his hand clamping down onto the parchment. Bury the iron cisterns. Build the supply caches under the sand. We will march through the outcasts' filth and claim what the gods have promised me. Saffron smiled, the expression thin and devoid of warmth. The trap was set, and the prince believed he was the one holding the rope. The spymaster and the advisor bowed as they left the prince to his fantasies. Out of earshot, Seela asked, "Has your brother-in-law started buying up the foundries?" Jashan nodded. Yes, and those fools who do not want to sell unexpectedly run into fatal accidents. Seela smiled, the expression of a man who had been patient for a very long time. Somewhere across the salt pan, 80 miles of dark desert lay between a prince's delusion and a canyon full of people who did not yet know they were already pieces on someone else's board.